so this is chapter 25, the Cold War. Just one chapter to do for this week, in light of the fact that you have your second short response due later this week. And so trying to make it easier on you probably next week. However, we will have to do 2 chapters to get back on track. We have just a couple weeks left in the semester and 5 more chapters to get through. All right, so the Cold War is going to be hugely significant really for the vast majority of the rest of the history we're going to be talking about. So remember now we are after World War II. During World War II, the United States and the Soviets were allies. And after World War II, the United States wanted to have Soviet cooperation going forward as the 2 emerging superpowers out of World War II. But eventually they are going to become very bitter rivals. If you've ever taken any kind of history class before, you know this. The Soviets are going to tighten their grip on Eastern Europe while the U.S. is demobilizing in Eastern Europe. The Soviets are going to be supporting new communist governments in Eastern Europe. They're going to be imprisoning opponents, censoring newspapers, establishing state-controlled radio stations, and guarding and patrolling borders to prevent people from leaving Eastern Europe, tightening their grip on this region, which is going to be hugely frightening for America. So this is a very famous quote given by the very famous Winston Churchill himself. He said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." And so that iron curtain is going to become the word used to describe the divide between East and West Europe. Western Europe being non-communist and Eastern Europe being communist. And in some cases, there's going to be an actual divide, as we'll see. But generally speaking, the Iron Curtain is a figurative term. So these Eastern European countries are going to essentially become satellite states controlled by the Soviet Union. And the loss of the freedom of these states is going to increase tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Thus, they enter what is called a Cold War. And the definition of a Cold War is a prolonged era of economic and political conflict without direct military conflict between the 2 rivals. So what does that mean? Throughout the Cold War, we don't like the Soviet Union. They don't like us. We are going to try to undermine each other at every turn, but we are never going to directly fight the Soviet Union in terms of like a military engagement. We will indirectly fight them through different powers, but never directly fight them. Hence, it's a Cold War and not a hot war, which is where you have, it's the more typical type of war where you have 2 groups of people fighting each other. So, very important to understand when you understand the Cold War. So George Kennan is going to become a leading expert on Soviet affairs. And in 1947, he wrote an article about the Soviet Union. And in it, throughout the article, he recommended that the United States adopt a policy called containment. Containment, in a general term, means blocking the expansion of Soviet influence and blocking any kind of expansion of communism in general. And you have to understand containment to understand the Cold War and really to understand our foreign policy between now and the fall of the Soviet Union, because if you don't get containment, then you're not going to understand a lot of what we do. I mean, when we talk about Korea, when we talk about Vietnam, why were we there? What was the reason for our involvement? And officially, the reason for that is going to be containment. Our fear of allowing the expansion of Soviet influence and by default communism in any way, shape, or form. So communism at the time was not limited to Eastern Europe. In 1947, there's going to be pressure from communists in the countries of Greece and Turkey. And this is going to be very alarming for the United States. Again, they see what is going on in Eastern Europe with the communist infiltration there and the fact that the people are not free. There's no freedom of the press. There's a lot of restrictions on what people can and cannot do. And the fact that communism is antithetical to our capitalist system. And so we're alarmed by this, the fact that the communists are gaining control in certain parts of Greece and Turkey. So Truman is going to accept, remember Truman is our president coming out of World War II, President Roosevelt dies in office of a massive hemorrhage, leaving his vice president, Truman, in control. And so he's going to accept the fact that it is now our responsibility as the leader of the free world to stop the expansion of communism. And so to that end, we start making our first moves in terms of this containment policy. On March 12, 1947, he asked Congress for $400 million to give military and economic aid for Greece and Turkey to make sure that communism doesn't take hold. So he had this to say about why he was asking for this aid. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. And Congress approved of his what he had to say and his reasoning. They overwhelmingly approved Truman's request. And that money is going to play a vital role in helping Greece and Turkey withstand the communist threat and not become communist nations. So this is the first real use of our containment policy. It marks the first time we use containment internationally. And from this moment forward, the U.S. pledges to use our strength to limit the spread of communism throughout the world. And as I said before, containment is really going to dominate U.S. foreign policy from 1947 all the way into the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. And it's hugely significant, so make sure you understand containment equals U.S. stops the spread of communism. So World War II is over. We're in the years following, and World War II just had completely devastated Europe on every level. And so because of that, people start looking for alternatives. I mean, they're very disillusioned. And in certain parts of Europe, again, the Communist Party starts to make inroads similar to what was going on in Greece and Turkey. And specifically, this was happening in France and Italy, both of which were just devastated by the war, economically, socially, and politically. So we become alarmed in the same way that we were alarmed that the communists were making inroads in Greece and Turkey. And our Secretary of State at the time, George Marshall, urged the United States to act quickly. So in June of 1947, we organized a massive economic aid package to essentially reconstruct Europe. The Marshall Plan's goal was to revive European hopes and to spark economic recovery so that they wouldn't turn to communism as an alternative. And over 4 years, we gave $13 billion to nations who accepted our aid. And those nations that accepted the aid under the Marshall Plan saw a 41% increase in production. So it was definitely helpful. And thus, there were two goals that we had here that we wanted to accomplish. Number one, to help reconstruct Europe following World War II, and number two, to contain communism. Meaning if people have economic, political, and social stability, they're not going to turn to communism as a possible alternative to their troubles. So the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan are essentially phases 1 and 2 of containment. Phase 3 takes place in 1949, in which the United States, Canada, and 10 other Western European nations form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO is a military alliance, which means that we are obliged to support other fellow members of NATO. And so this is the first time we break from our standard isolationist approach, and we enter into a permanent military alliance. We've been in alliances temporarily, but never a permanent military alliance before. NATO, formed in 1949 and still around today, is the first time we do that. And this military organization essentially escalates the Cold War because the Western European nations, again, are the not communist ones. They're all joining together in a military alliance with Canada and the United States. So in Eastern Europe, you're going to see their own military alliance. Theirs was called the Warsaw Pact. So it was basically the communist answer to NATO. So different Eastern European countries in the Soviet Union formed their own military alliance. And now essentially you have two hostile military alliances across a divided Europe, which was not the hope. Again, we've just come out of World War II. Not far before that was World War I. And now we've got this essentially military standoff in Europe that's not only going to be isolated to Europe, but eventually is going to spread throughout the whole world. This is not what was wanted, but yet this is what happens with these two antagonists. The United States, capitalist democratic country, and the Soviet Union, a communist country. All right, so going on with other issues of the early years of the Cold War. So remember that after the defeat of Germany and the city of Berlin itself was divided into 4 different zones. In 1948, the United States, Great Britain, and France decided to merge their zones and form a new German republic. And so if you're wondering what the fourth zone was, you could probably imagine where we're going with this, that was the Soviets. So the 3 capitalistic nations are going to merge their zones and help Germany form their own republic. And in response, on June 24th, 1948, Stalin is going to cut off all highway and railroad traffic west of Berlin. So what that means is he's essentially isolating West Berlin. They can't get anything in and they can't get anything out. They're cut off from any kind of aid. And so that leaves 2.2 million people without coal for 45 days, coal being the main way people heated their homes at the time, and no food for 36 days. So this is the first Cold War test of wills. What is the United States going to do in response? The United States, again, being kind of the de facto leader of the Western world at this point. How are they going to respond? Well, Truman decides he's not going to give in. He's not going to allow the Soviets to essentially gain control of the rest of Berlin and the rest of Germany, because that's what Stalin is hoping to do there. And so how to get aid into these people if this part of Berlin is surrounded and you can't get any ground traffic in or out? Well, they're going to airlift food and fuel to the people of West Berlin, in what became known as the Berlin Airlift. They're going to airlift 4,500 tons of food and fuel to the people of West Berlin. And this is a testament to American power and will that we were able to do this. And on May 12, 1949, Stalin relents. He reopens all road and rail traffic going into Western Europe, and the tension eases. So this is really typical of what you're going to see throughout the Cold War, where you have the two countries kind of testing each other. They're not directly getting involved militarily. You're not like shooting at each other. But this is how the tension is going to play out. All right. So looking at containment policy in Asia. So our policy of containment is not going to be specifically limited to Europe. It's going to be concerned with the rest of the world as well, and increasingly concerned with the growth of communism in Asia. So let's look at Japan first. So remember, after World War II, Japan has been defeated by the United States. And essentially, General Douglas MacArthur is in charge of the American occupation of Japan. And there he assists the Japanese people of writing a new constitution and establishing a democratic government. Additionally, they rebuild factories, specifically electronic industries. There's land reform, so that Japan is producing by pre-war levels by 1953. And MacArthur was actually very well respected for his firm but fair leadership by the Japanese. And going forward, the U.S. and the Japanese begin to view each other as very firm allies, which continues on to this day. And so by exerting our influence in this way, we are able to protect Japan from communist infiltration. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case in China. So following World War II, a civil war is going to divide the nation of China. There's going to be two sides: the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists led by the leader Mao Zedong. Even though we aid Chiang Kai-shek, he still ends up losing to Mao Zedong. On October 1st of 1949, Mao Zedong helps to establish the People's Republic of China, which is a communist country. China remains communist to this day, of course. And Chiang Kai-shek and his army are going to flee to Taiwan. In 1950, as two fellow communist countries, China and the Soviet Union, are going to form a treaty. No surprise there. And this is a defeat for our Cold War diplomacy. China, of course, is a very large country. It is now communist, which is not what we want to see. That is the opposite of containment, because we've seen now the expansion of communism to China. And so as a response, we won't recognize communist China as a legitimate government for a while. And we'll get to the point where we start recognizing them as a legitimate government later on. But instead, we recognize the government of Taiwan, indicated by the map over there off of mainland China, as the only legitimate government of China. So the first military test of our containment policy is going to come with the outbreak of the Korean War. So Korea is in a very strategic position. It borders China and Russia, and it is also only 100 miles from Japan. And following World War II, the United States and the Soviets are going to divide Korea into two separate countries, and they're divided at the 38th parallel. The Soviets are going to establish a communist government in the north, while the U.S. supports the non-communist government of South Korea. On June 25th of 1950, the North Korean army is going to attack South Korea. And this is just stunning to the United States. And again, it's a test of containment. And Truman sees it as a chance to prove that the Democrats, he being a Democrat, the Democratic Party is not, quote unquote, soft on communism, which many Republicans were accusing it of being. He calls for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. Now, normally the Soviets would veto any kind of UN action in Korea, because, of course, North Korea is communist, and so they would support their fellow communists, and they are firmly established in North Korea, but they were actually boycotting the UN due to the United States' failure to recognize the new Chinese communist government. And so, as a result, the UN is going to condemn North Korea and send aid to South Korea. The U.S. troops are commanded by General MacArthur, an obvious choice, him having commanded our troops in the Pacific during World War II and to have been in charge of the Japanese reconstruction after World War II. So even though this is a coalition of different countries that form the United Nations, the United States was the core of the UN Army. We made up the bulk of it, but there were 14 other nations involved. So again, this is a war that is fought under the auspices of the UN. So there was no formal declaration of war by Congress during the Korean War. By September of 1950, I should say rather, MacArthur is able to recapture South Korea. And in October, he crosses the 38th parallel with a goal of reuniting all of Korea under a non-communist government. Now, at this point, the Chinese are alarmed that the Americans and the rest of the UN coalition are making inroads into North Korea, very close to China. And so they get involved and they counterattack and they drive the forces back south of the 38th parallel. So Truman decides to focus solely on liberating South Korea from the communists and not to push into North Korea. And General MacArthur openly questioned this. He felt that it was not enough to just drive the communists out of South Korea, that we actually had to roll communism back in North Korea as well. And because he openly questioned Truman, who is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, as the president, he is removed from office. Fighting is going to last 2 more years, and really in those 2 years there's going to be a lot of stalemate. There's not going to be a whole lot of movement one way or another, and a lot of frustration. So there's an armistice that is signed on July 27th, 1953. So there's a ceasefire, no more fighting, and the 38th parallel remains the dividing line between North and South Korea. So what's the significance, the takeaways from the Korean War? Number one, in terms of U.S. politics, the public frustration of the war leads to General Eisenhower's election as president in 1952. No surprise that they're going to look to the famous general who helped us win World War II as an alternative to the Democratic Truman and any other Democratic candidate. It's going to strengthen the U.S. ties with Japan and South Korea, exacerbate tensions between the United States, China, and Russia, and result in 30,000 U.S. troops remaining in South Korea, because there technically was never an official peace treaty ending the Korean War. There was just a ceasefire. So, talking a little bit about some more social aspects of the 1950s. We're going to get more into this in the next chapter. But generally speaking, in the 1950s, things are good. Of course, not for everybody. But generally, there's a lot of material prosperity throughout the 1950s. And people tend to view the 1950s as a time of great nostalgia. Like it's some sort of golden age in American history. And we'll get more into that and why that might be in the next chapter, which again is more focused on social issues at this time. But underlying this material prosperity is going to be a lot of anxiety and fear. And the sources of that anxiety and fear are the encroachment of international communism, the fear of domestic subversion. So that means the fear that there's, communists living among them who might seek to overthrow the United States government. And a huge one, the fear of the possibility of nuclear annihilation, which with the development of nuclear weapons by first the United States and then the Soviet Union, that is a possibility. So again, these are not imaginary fears. We tend to look back on the Cold War as with, hindsight, and hindsight's 2020. We know that there was no outbreak of nuclear war, but that doesn't mean there couldn't have been. That was definitely a possibility. By 1954, the United States and the Soviet Union both have atomic weapons. And so that was a possibility, again, that there could have been nuclear warfare. School children were taught to, quote unquote, duck and cover. As you see in the pictures over there on the right, get under their desks in case there was nuclear warfare. That would have done absolutely nothing to help protect them from a nuclear weapon, but hey, I guess you got to do something. A lot of people built fallout shelters. Again, this was a real possibility. And President Eisenhower and the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, do not help. They add to the anxiety, stating that the U.S. is going to no longer be involved in limited, expensive wars, and that the U.S. will consider using nuclear weapons to halt communism. And so this is a form of what we call brinkmanship, or the idea that we're willing to go to the brink of nuclear war if necessary. So adding to this this fear is this fear that the Soviets are somehow going to outdo us. And that seems to actually be happening on October 4th, 1957, when a beeping sound is heard on TV from a 184-pound satellite called Sputnik. This shatters the U.S. self-confidence that we are in some way inherently superior to the Soviets, because Russia has overcome our scientific and technological lead that we had developed throughout the course of World War II. And so we are going to respond to this. Hey, they're able to launch the first satellite. We need to do something about this. In 1958, we start our response with the formation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. By 1959, 1 year later, there are 7 men who become our first astronauts. Additionally, there is the National Defense Education Act, which funds science and math programs in national public schools and colleges to help further our technological advances for the next. So again, I mentioned the fact that domestic subversion is one of the fears that many Americans have. This fear that there's going to somehow be communists who are working to overthrow our government. Specifically, there was a fear that the communists were somehow going to infiltrate the State Department. And the State Department, if you're not aware, is the part of the government that controls our relationship with other countries. And so Richard Nixon, who we're going to know more about later on, and the House Un-American Activities Committee is going to investigate this. And they discovered that there was an official by the name of Alger Hiss who was a Soviet spy in the 1930s. There was a British-American spy network that was sending information about the our atomic weapons to the Soviets. And that results, this investigation, in the arrest and execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg under the charge of espionage. And you can see a picture of them on the right for handing off American plans for atomic weapons to the Soviets. And so this starts what's known as the Red Scare. So Soviet Union, the flag of the Soviet Union is red, hence the Red Scare. And this is going to infiltrate all levels of society, even going into the entertainment industry. In Hollywood, 500 writers, directors, and actors were essentially blacklisted as being possible communists or communist sympathizers. And if you think back to the movies of the time, there's a lot of like alien invasion type movies, and this preys on our anxieties, like alien invasions, alien infiltrating America, the fear of communist infiltration. It's an analogy that's playing off of those fears, so you can see it playing out even in the entertainment industry. So Americans throughout the 1950s believed that they were locked in a life and death struggle with communism, and it looked like America was losing again. Sputnik, the exposure of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg is part of this whole spy ring, and this is really a time of fear for Americans. So in comes this guy, picture over there in the top right hand corner, Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, who is going to play on these fears. He exploits the political climate and on February 9th of 1950 by saying that he has discovered that there are 205 communists working in the State Department and that he has a list of their names. Now later on that dropped to 57. And later on, it was proven that he never uncovered one communist working in the State Department. So there were no communists working in the State Department. And so the term McCarthyism is coined because of his actions. And McCarthyism is making unsubstantiated accusations of disloyalty without any actual evidence. So in the spring of 1954, McCarthy organizes this TV series in which he investigates the U.S. Army, saying again that there's a bunch of communists working in the Army. And so, of course, playing off of the fear of Americans for communist infiltration. And throughout the TV series, it's pretty clear that he's bullying witnesses, he's twisting testimony, there's some obviously false evidence, and it turns the public against him. And on December of 1954, Congress formally censured him for dishonorable conduct. But again, this proves that there is a real fear of communist expansion, not only throughout the world, but within the United States as well. Okay, so our first chapter question here is, how real was the domestic threat of communism? Remember, domestic means within the United States. So how real was that threat? Was it something that was over-exaggerated, or was this a real possibility? All right, so we're going to end up this chapter on the Cold War by briefly mentioning some other domestic issues not precisely related to communism. So the first is going to be the Taft-Hartley Act. So throughout the 1950s, prices for goods are going to rise, and in return, labor unions are going to demand higher wages to account for rising prices of other goods. In 1946, there are going to be 5,000 different strikes throughout the United States involving 4.7 million workers. And conservatives argue that the unions here are abusing their power, leading to the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act is an act that severely curbs the power of unions. It says that the federal government can issue an 80-day injunction against a strike. It prohibits direct union contributions to political campaigns. It requires that leaders sign documents saying that they are not communists, and it leads to right-to-work laws in various states in which people who are non-union workers can be hired to do work. And moving into the civil rights, which of course throughout our whole class, I've emphasized that the movement for civil rights was not confined to the 1950s and 1960s. That's probably the most famous aspect of the civil rights movement, and that's what we're getting into now. But do know and note some of the other early leaders that we've talked about who came before this. So think back to those people and think of them as the early civil rights leaders. But getting into the quote-unquote civil rights movement here, in 1946, there was an election, and there was a movement to get black voter registration in the South. Because remember, technically, black people can vote, but practically speaking, they can't due to various laws that allowed southern states to get around that. And so, as a result of this voter registration drive in the South, KKK members threaten and kill anyone who attempts to register Black people to vote in the South. And so, because of the outcry against this, the Truman administration commissions a study. And in the fall of 1947, they published their report, and they call for stronger anti-lynching laws, a civil rights division in the Justice Department, and a permanent fair employment practices committee to help combat issues of civil rights in the South specifically. But this was blocked by a powerful Southern coalition of Southern politicians in Congress. And so none of these recommendations were taken by the government at the time. At the Democratic National Convention, the Minneapolis Mayor Hubert Humphrey is going to call for the Democratic Party to establish a civil rights platform. So remember, a platform is like the series of things that the political party is going to work on. So if they are going to get a Democratic president in power and a Democratic Congress, these are the things they want to see done. That's what a platform is. And so what he's saying is that the Democratic Party should make civil rights a part of their platform. And the Southern members of the Democratic Party walk out when they hear this call. And they nominate a separate presidential candidate, Strom Thurmond, and they form the Dixiecrat Party, as they saw it. So the members of the Democratic Party that are from the South and pro-segregation. So even though Truman wins, the Dixiecrats carry the Southern states. And this shows that Southern Democrats will desert their own party over the issue of segregations. And they are going to continue to block civil rights legislation going forward. So that is where we will today, leading into our last chapter question. Could the U.S. have done more to advance the cause of civil rights immediately following World War II? If so, then what could they have done? And I will post that on our discussion board for this week.